Great. Well, thanks everyone for coming. I know we're a little squished in here, but that's all right. We have our second speaker, Peter Topalovic from City of Hamilton, engineer, transportation demand manager, is it? Okay. So I'm not sure. Okay, I think I'll let you talk.
Sure.
Introduce it so we can get going here.
Okay, thanks a lot. Hi everybody. I'll introduce myself. Obviously, I'm an engineer, but I'm actually a computer engineer. So likely the least likely person to be talking about things about urban planning, geography, and transportation. But I came back to Mac for a master's in engineering and public policy, and that's where I learned more about I used to do automation. Now I'm working on city building issues and policy work. We'll get into that a lot. Before I do though, I just want to, is everyone here in geography? No, planning? No, still planning, right?
Still planning.
So, if you're not in geography, what are people in? Oh, okay.
History.
History. All right, so we've got a few other people in different spheres, a lot of geographers. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about regeneration first before we go into my real focus is, I guess, transportation at the end of the day. But I want to get there eventually because I think everything's obviously, I'm sure we talked about this in different courses of yours, everything's connected. And regeneration really is that the principle that I like that is a sort of systems level principle that helps us understand these concepts and how they integrate together. I have a terrible title for my talk, Livable and Resilient Cities and Sustainable Mobility. So it's a bit of a mixed bag, but I think I'll have a point by the end, so you bear with me. First, it's basically three parts. I want to talk about the natural environment and then the built environment and how transportation sort of links all these things together. I didn't think much about transportation when I was at Mac. I was actually primarily a car driver. I lived in the city and I came to Mac as a student and I thought, well, I did carpool probably, but I didn't think that transportation was much involved with land use issues, quality of life, or health. Probably because I was an engineer, I'm not sure. But now the connection is so obvious, I don't know how any of us can work in any of our fields without understanding how these things work together. And I do have planners that come to me, and I love the planners in the city, but because I work in transportation planning, which means I work in public works, the engineering department, that they'll ask, well, what's transportation demand management? And maybe you haven't heard of the term, maybe you have, but it's really policies, programs, and strategies that help reduce the use of single occupant vehicles. And then of course, for all the benefits that come with that, I'm sure you don't understand, right? If we reduce single occupant vehicle use, we can make better use of our roads. But I'm surprised how people don't understand the term if they're in business. And maybe you have heard the term, maybe you haven't, but sustainable mobility even itself is a poorly understood term, but something so integral to all the work that you might or will be doing in the future. So, starting with regeneration, because it involves all these things I'm about to talk about. Obviously, the natural built environment aren't separated from each other. They are completely linked. They are one and the same. They're one complex system. They're not two different systems. And obviously, they intersect at various scales, both very large and different scales, but also in our work on the ground level. Whether we're doing a transportation project, it eventually leads to maybe runoff water in Coos Paradise. So everything that seems unconnected, obviously they are connected. And this system, whether it's the city ecosystem or the larger one, is really vulnerable at the end to any kind of unpredictable behavior. So how does the system respond to these unpredictable things that might occur? And maybe you remember some 100-year storm events in Hamilton that happened consecutively over 5 years that caused a lot of flooding. Well, how did our system respond to that kind of behavior? The other thing is, of course, it's constantly changing. We're building things, both the natural environment and the urban environment are just essentially changing with each other. And if we pave something, that's a huge change versus if we unpave something, which I think has been done recently in the parking lot down near Coots. So, talking about the natural environment first, I do like this. I think it's mostly true, but sometimes I come off as a doomy, gloomy environmentalist, so I will try not to be that. But let's start with doomy, gloomy. Maybe you've seen this. Obviously, we know that for millions of years, in the era of evolutionary development, talk about history badly for a little bit, we essentially interacted with our environment very similarly for so long, and then all of a sudden, probably at the time of the agricultural revolution and then the industrial revolution, we changed things so drastically, so fast that our planet essentially has really not recovered from that. That's where climate change comes in, and of course, supporting exponential growth of population. You must have heard of this before. And probably you've heard of the ecological footprint. So what is the Earth's capacity to carry our activities and replenish itself once we use its resources? And you can see from, this is old work, really from the 90s, and then refreshed in the 2000s, about our projected footprint and the actual carrying capacity of the Earth. So current global ecological footprint is 2.2 global hectares per person. The regenerative capacity of the Earth is 1.8, which means that, there's a picture here somewhere, we need 1.2 Earths to sustain our current behavior. So I just watched a movie called Elysium. I don't know if you've seen it. Matt Damon. I'm not giving it a plug, it was all right. But, it's eventually we leave the Earth and we live in a space station. And that's the only way at this point, or the moon, that we're going to be able to fix this problem unless we start basically working within the carrying capacity of the Earth. And then in the 1970s, then the 1990s, and then more recently, the Club of Rome had made these projections. They did these models as to when are we going to hit that point, this sweet spot, in which we can no longer sustain our behaviors. And the predicted trend, I think, is this dashed line. And if you look at, they started in the 70s, right, and they remodeled in the 90s. So it turns out that their model is actually doing fairly well. Most experts did say that it wouldn't. Their numbers were totally off. Their model was wrong. And models are always inherently wrong to a certain extent. But if you look at their numbers in every other trend, whichever one, food per capita, industrial output, global population, everything is following their trend line. Will they be, they've made doom predictions like 3 or 4 times now. So will 2030 be the next doom prediction? Or what other people think is that we're already in it. It's not. We're talking about climate change mitigation. That is doing things to reduce the amount of fossil fuels that we're burning and reduce the amount of emissions. But now we're also talking about adaptation, because climate change isn't something that's going to come. It's something that's here, right? So perhaps we've hit the peak oil and we've exceeded the carrying capacity. We're perhaps already there. And then the other question is then what are we going to do? Because we still have to make our system resilient, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But how are we gonna deal with these impacts? We still have to live here, and 2030 is approaching if they're right. So doom is a poor motivator for anything. I've just told you, well, the world's gonna end anyway in 2030 apparently. That's not really helpful, I don't think. And so I think that's the problem with the environmental movement itself, especially in the early years, is that, well, okay, what can we do otherwise? And that's why we talk about mitigation. We also talk about adaptation, because we can do things to deal with the problems that we've sort of fostered since the Industrial Revolution. Do you think it's good to be efficient? Hands, efficiency is good. Okay, that's like half a trick question. Efficiency is kind of good, right? Sustainable development, the idea of something being sustainable where we're developing, sustainable where we're just growing, I think it's an odd concept to put together. But we're optimizing, generally speaking, a part of the system, right? We optimize this piece of the system and assuming the rest of the system is going to stay the same. That generally doesn't happen, right? We optimize one part of the system, it has an effect on the rest of the system. So we did really great at making this really efficient, but we end up causing so much more harm potentially in the rest of the system. So that's like this idea of efficiency can be good, but it can also be disastrous depending on what the situation is. So this is Hamilton Harbor. Have anyone seen this? Have you seen this before? Some of you. Back to history again. Here's what the shoreline used to look like when it was settled in 1846, I think. Could be wrong. This is the infill of what we have now, and this is essentially our industrial core. So my reason for saying this, to overlap now what we have today, we did really good at concentrating a lot of our industry in one place, right? Because we maximized the efficiency of our industrial sector because we want to maximize our yield. It was efficient. We then maintained a popular beach area right beside it because we maximized the beach area. We captured all our housing in single-family homes so people can have, the kind of home they ever wanted, right? A light picket fence and a place to have your children succeed. On essentially the mountain brow, it's not all, but it's mostly residential. And then we had downtown as the business area, right, where people will shop. So people will live here and they'll all drive down there and they'll shop. And then we'll have agriculture, right, that will feed us. So of course, for sure that while we did optimize different parts of our system, and the impact of that optimization was, I don't want to say disastrous, but again, I'm a doom and gloom environmentalist. But there's definitely some effects that and we know this, right? We know about Randall Reef and the fact that this is Hamilton Harbor is still one of the areas of concern on the Great Lakes. We know the effects of suburban sprawl, the loss of farmland, the impact to businesses even in the downtown core when you have lots of one-way streets because they're efficient as well, right? People love one-way streets because they get them to where they need to go in their car. So everything is efficient. It sounds like, if I describe them all, they seem very efficient to me. In fact, we don't have a huge traffic problem in Hamilton. Some of you might be from Toronto, you've not been to Toronto before. I can be at Spadina almost any time of the day, and it's busy. That has a lot more traffic than any one street in Hamilton ever has. I don't know ever will, but. So, I guess that's my caution to this idea of efficiency, and if you're in economics, maybe you're not, you've heard of the tragedy of commons. That is this metaphor for sheep grazing on a commons. Everyone owns a few sheep. They're supposed to get equal sheep, but then they realize the marginal cost of adding one extra sheep doesn't seem to degrade the commons that much, but they can increase their yield. Problem is that everyone does that, and eventually you exceed the carrying capacity of the commons because you all are adding extra sheep when you're not supposed to. But there's no one to govern how the commons is used, because the commons is a common good. What's the root cause? Well, when you have a public good and you do not bear the entire social cost of your action, because there was not, the true cost of adding the sheep was never realized by the farmer. They only had to pay for the sheep. What's that lead to? Well, it leads to tragedy of commons and externalities, right? We have the externalities and nobody pays for them. So what do? Well, if you're an economist, you try to correct the market imbalance, the market failure. You internalize the externality. Someone pays for the cost, the true cost. Maybe you've heard these concepts before. I mean, every time we talk about ecological economics, environmental economics, they talk about these ideas. I've given you a really basic run through of it. So what is resiliency? We want to create a system, whether it's this city's Hamilton system or our total global ecosystem, a system that, if it's resilient, it can actually absorb the disturbances and still actually retain its basic function. That's what we want when we talk about climate change adaptation. That's what we want when we design essentially everything. We want to create a resilient system. Have you heard of resiliency before? Okay, good. So we're on the same page. Regeneration. What we have is the municipality as an ecosystem, right? There's all the things, our governance, our culture, the economic portion of it. We have resiliency, like I just spoke about, in the natural and socioeconomic environment. So energy and food, infrastructure, our brownfields and how we remediate them. But there's a whole process that has to go on in terms of maintaining that and governing that. And that is both the engagement process, so people need to be engaged. You need to understand what people want and also to educate them on maybe what they should want. There's a strong community foundation in this because in the end, we all live in neighborhoods and communities. So the idea of the municipality and the ecosystem essentially as one system. And then this will eventually achieve restorability. We want to bring back the services that we have. We want to protect our ecosystem services. We want to have adaptive reuse and then, you know, make sure that our old buildings become new again. I think that, I feel like you understand this concept, so I'm going to move on right away. I talked a little bit about flooding. This is the Red Hill Valley. If you've probably driven on it, but you maybe saw the flooding. That's New Orleans. So we realized that if we damage our ecosystem, it no longer provides the level of service that we require. We've done a lot of work as a city in terms of low impact development. I think if you, obviously we have impervious services. They draw water right to the sewer system. The sewer system then, or the storm system, has to spread water back to the lake right away because it becomes overloaded. Obviously, you want to have more impervious pavement versus, pervious pavements that are impervious pavement. We've done a fair bit of stuff in terms of, again, low impact development, bioretention in parking lots as an example, semi-permeable pavement. I know McMaster has done a lot of work on this as well. MIP has a plan for linear wetlands on green roofs, and we've done a lot of work as a city to get some, not always green roofs because there's been some aversion to them, but even City Hall has an experimental green roof on it. And places to grow, of course, is defining a green belt, a place where we would protect our natural environment. In terms of these regeneration projects, right? Because regeneration projects are not just about, just the grass beside this river, but that's also very important. They're about a sense of place and placemaking. So I really like the concept of, it's not just about, the problem is that even when we talk about efficiency, we're like, okay, we'll have a low impact development piece to this project. But what about the sense of place and, the cyclist? We can cover a lot of birds with one stone when we look at this from a more systems level perspective. So I really love it. And this was a fine park probably at the time, but with protecting that water, preventing the runoff, you've also created a sense of place. So I'm gonna move over to the built environment because I think it's probably more down what kind of work that I do, and it's really topical right now. This is Lister Block. You've all been to James Street North, Art Crawl, Super Crawl. If you're second or third year students, maybe you were here when this building was restored. For most of my life, it looked like that. And of course, it was going to be torn down multiple times, then completely refaced, and then eventually restored. So that's what we have today, with the city being one of its primary tenants. And some ground floor tenants, a restaurant and art gallery. So it's a really good example of remediation. And we always, there's always a public debate about what's the worth of the building. Why not tear it down and build something new versus keeping what we have? And we'll talk about that a little bit later. Keep that in mind. Also, there was some work done by Pamela Place on perverse incentives. I'll talk a little bit about why. I mean, most cities find themselves using financial tools that don't really capture the cost of living in the suburbs or building a house in the suburbs versus building that house in the downtown core. So many a time, but not always, these municipal rates that are being charged on these developments don't represent their true cost, so there's an externality. And one example here is, here's what the conventional development charge looks like, and there's a difference of $10,000. So there's some of that accounting for the impact of the single-family home is there, but generally, if we use a density-sensitive development charge, it's a much different range. So your larger apartment unit actually is cheaper than it was, but also your single attached home is actually more expensive in terms of its charge. So right now, essentially, we subsidize suburban development at the expense of a whole bunch of things in terms of having to get water there and taking up, usually these are greenfield developments because they're cheaper. They're cheaper, but they're only artificially cheaper. In the end, the taxpayer has to they take on the burden so the person who's trying to get a cheap home, and then at the end of the day, also has the burden of being in that, not only being in that area, but we all suffer from the development. That's probably a really stark stance on it. I'm just maybe presenting one side of the argument right now. But for sure, I think we can agree that taxes don't always reflect the impact of a person's home or the business operating in wherever they might be. You know, there's been some criticism too of having business parks in greenfields so far away from the downtown or other industrial lands. Some others would say, well, you're spreading it out, so you're actually minimizing the impact as you spread it around cities. So this, again, I talked a little bit about the solution, but we want to base pricing on density, location, and type of use. It's not just about density, but where are you building that development? Sometimes also one of the criticisms of LEED are that it's like the LEED assumes that you're building the building in isolation of anything else. Like it just doesn't matter where it goes. But of course, where you build something really does matter. And then how it interfaces with the street, which is something I want to get into really a little more deeply, because that's been a criticism of a lot of developments recently, is that yes, they're green, and yes, they look nice, but they face a parking lot instead of facing the sidewalk. What Hamilton has done, I think, fairly well with is looking at brownfields, because of course we have the largest collection of brownfields in the region. Brownfield, which I hope you know, is essentially was developed before, has a derelict building on it, or hasn't been remediated yet and has some contamination. We have an ERASE program. It's an acronym. I don't remember what it stands for, but essentially it incentivizes brownfield development by reducing or eliminating the development charges that the developer would pay, but also some tax incentives, as well as speeding up the process and eliminating the red tape for developing on the brownfield land. So that's been successful. This is one of the examples. This is near Queen Street. So that was a former industrial site turned into, I think it was now a retirement home. Of course, you know, had we not had that program, it wouldn't have been financially feasible for a developer to develop. And we're taking a nodes and corridors approach to the development of our city, really, where we want to intensify development along these nodes and corridors. You see, this is James Street. This is James Street south here, and this is the A and B line corridor, what the LRT is supposedly going to travel along, and some major nodes. So we're building all around these major transit nodes. So this is the first time in this presentation, at least that our planning strategy is really relies heavily upon our transit, our hard transit strategy. So if you look at these two maps, essentially they overlay on each other. And the same nodes and corridors identified in this map match the A line. Have you seen this map before? Yeah? People know LRT, light rail transit. Heard of it before? So what happened in Hamilton. This is the B line, obviously, the one we're focused on as of late, and then the rest of the lines. The rest of the lines are meant to be BRT lines, bus rapid transit, and main line LRT. Regardless of the mode, because the mode isn't as important as, in my opinion, as segregating the facility that the transit will travel on. So what's really important is having predictable transit that integrates with nodes, that those nodes have a sense of place, and that cars and other vehicles don't travel in the same lane as the transit. LRT, BRT is much secondary to the design, and I think that's really interesting. As a community, we're obsessed with what will the vehicle type be. We should be obsessed with, if you come to wait for transit, where are you waiting in? Is there a coffee shop? Are there benches? Does this area have a sense of place? Even McNabb Transit Terminal, what would you do there other than wait for a bus? You know, it looks great, I have no criticism, and there's a whole reason why it happened the way it did. But it doesn't really have a sense of place in terms of, or a thing to do other than wait for a bus. Moving in the future, if you want to build a transit terminal that people are going to really want to use, it probably should integrate better with the land uses around it, and also have appropriate land uses when you're waiting for some form of transit. And even tell you that transit's coming, when it's coming. So there's these. The problem is that transportation engineers are designing one half of it, and planners are thinking about the long-term plan on the other side. And they aren't, generally speaking, coming together. So the whole concept of resiliency and generation and all that stuff essentially ends up relying on people actually working together And it's no criticism of the planners or the silos or bureaucracy. It happens everywhere, and it's well repeated across North America. We know that it's happening, and we even try to break down the silos. It's not like we sit there and say, no, we're just not going to work with planners because we're engineers. That's not what's happening. At the same time, it's a big animal, and lots of things going on at once, and lots of vested interests. So you don't always get what you want, but I think that this system could be considered a compromise system, but at least it matches what our plan was, and we can actually go and implement along the same plan. We have population changes, and we know that, again, the triangles are declining populations. We know that's sort of changing now after 2006, 2011, and beyond. And we know that some of these areas that even 5 years ago are neighborhoods that are changing a fair bit, including the North End. If you've been to the North End, obviously James Street North itself is changing, but it's also gentrifying, for better or for worse, but there's a huge amount of gentrification, and housing values have soared. So again, we've had this declining population in the areas marked essentially by the triangles, and what ends up happening is things that you probably have seen in the media, right? Well, the building's derelict now. We have to, or the school enrollments are lower. They might be better in 20 years, but the incentive is to knock that building down and rebuild the building, because that's how the funding formulas are when you look at how education is funded, how we build and renew schools. So this is the middle one, Scott Park, in the West Bend area. That's right beside the stadium, and that's been itself a long debated what to do with this building. The other one, of course, the stadium itself should be in the location of the stadium, West Harbor, and that was a big debate. We're here for that. But this approach that we're taking is meant to mitigate the decline. So if you can bring higher order transit with appropriate land uses and appropriate building types into these areas, then you can bring people back to living there because they'll be desirable places to live. And of course, I should say you should do that by also thinking about appropriate housing for low-income individuals as well. So I think gentrification can be good as long as maybe you use a little bit of Vancouverism in there, and that you build low-income housing amongst market housing. Question: who thinks which has the higher density? Who says the buildings on the left over there has a higher density? And the buildings on the right, the other half class, almost half and half. So they're about equal. And so they're definitely, when we talk about intensification, we can talk about it in a whole lot of ways. I think there's a lot of ways to deal with Berlin. New Orleans is an example. Berlin's another great example. And I think Paris as well. And having these 6-story sort of walk-up places spread over longer distances, rather than sort of this almost suburban style version of building building here. And the reason why some would favor this is that when it comes to the interaction with the street, you've got a much better street interaction here and a much better sense of place versus what you have going on over here, which doesn't lead well to ground floor commercial and walkability. So again, this is downtown. So actually, I live in Durand. This is from the Durand neighborhood, just by downtown. We have a lot of these buildings, but of course, the Durand Neighborhood Association in 1972 pledged to stop this development because they wanted their historical homes to remain. And so now in that Durand neighborhood, there's been a lot of balancing act between what to build, how you should build it, and what you should knock down. We've had a lot of intensification projects recently. They're being announced now. It's great. It is somewhat great to see these cranes here in Hamilton. I hadn't seen them for a long time. I moved to downtown 6 years ago. There wasn't much going on, and 6 years later, it blows me away about the changes that have happened just downtown. Even McMaster students might actually dare to venture. Even I lived in Hamilton, and I grew up in the East End. I went to McMaster, and I was like, oh, downtown. I literally crossed through it every day. But that's all it was for me, was a pass-through at the time. So 8, 9, 10 years later, and I changed my tune. But I lived in a McMaster bubble. And I know that some students still do. Probably not as much on the geography student side of things, but yeah, it was interesting. It's great to see that bubble's breaking slowly, but it's happening. And so that, entering this sort of mid-rise concept out. So through the whole corridor, this Nose and Corridor strategy, we've actually gone through the Beeline corridor extensively and through design charades and engagement with the community. Because when we talk about regeneration, it has to include the people who live in these neighborhoods and what they wanted to see of their streetscape and how the streets interact with the buildings. Again, there is room for tall buildings as well. I'm not against them. I'll show you a few, again, in the other mid-rise precinct. An example like this, which is very interesting as well. I talk about adaptive reuse. Another example where you have an old building, you make it into a condo, we have those already. And then making these developments transit-oriented. They're compact, they have mixed uses, people are living and working and shopping in the same place. Again, I talked about placemaking. Where do you want to wait for a bus or a train? And that changes, that does affect how you will use it. And then there's, of course, an emphasis on transit when we're developing these buildings. But again, taking a siloed approach, that doesn't always happen. So we looked at some of the building heights and making sure that, at the street level, you have a certain height, and then if you're going to have a tall building, you can build it backwards. I think you've seen this. Again, we did a lot of work on that because it's not just about when you're at the street level interacting with the building, but also the kind of shadows it's casting, and you want to make sure that there's a lot of sunlight on the street. So a lot of interesting work went on, and engage the community like this was very fruitful, I think. But one thing I want to stop on is, where does the door face? So how many people have heard of smart centers? Walmart. Most smart centers, most Walmarts here are part of a smart center project. They're just a developer. They have little penguins, so most of the Walmarts you see have penguins beside it. They look really cute penguins. I don't want to, if you work for smart centers, I'm really sorry. But there's an incentive right now to build that kind of development where you're even putting like the bank goes in front of the road, but where's the door face? The Shoppers Drug Mart, and the door faces to the parking lot, and the parking lot even getting between that Shoppers and that CIBC is kind of muddled as to how you get there, especially if you're at a mobility challenge. So while we're doing some of the right things, and we're requiring people to build at the sidewalk, which is good because from a pedestrian perspective it makes sense to go on all these doors, going from door to door, that whole idea of walking between places. It doesn't really, there's ways around it too, and that's what's happened in some of the developments. So go to Center, what used to be Center Mall on Barton and Kenworth. Go to pretty much most of our Meadowlands, the Meadowlands themselves, right? Even they have bike lanes, but I would say fairly treacherous bike lanes. So we've got this, we're trying, but maybe the policy environment wasn't there. So then you have to go back to your official plan and amend it, and change it, make it better, and get a new zoning bylaw so that you can require developers to do what you think, what your city needs. So that's what we're talking about. And we're talking about, of course, eyes on the street. If you've read, thank you, Jay. Sorry, Jay. If you've read her, Eyes on the Street, very important because, and she talked a lot about, you probably read her book. She talked, she's way ahead of her time, but she talked about, if you have a bar, and you have a barber, and you have everyone facing the street, and you have all these walk-ups, you have different activity during different times of the day and night, and you have people coming and going at different times of day, and of course it's safer, so there's an idea of safety. But it really, I like the concept of safety, but for me it's all about, of course, transporting people as well. So you can't transport people if you haven't given them a good way to walk, and if you have given them nothing to walk to. And I talked a little bit about sun shadow, so again, a lot of interesting design. Look at materials, being able to integrate the new and the old together. And we also looked at parking, because parking is probably one of the main issues that we face when in terms of pricing people's behaviors. Because if parking is free, and parking's available and parking's up front, then the more likelihood you are more likely to drive. So by being more creative with parking and putting parking underground and or having back access or front access, you can really change how people are going to behave and interact with the building. And of course, low impact development I talked about in the beginning, I think really needs to come into how we design the streetscape, because streets aren't just for people and cars and transit. They have to be about making sure that the stormwater that our buildings are essentially helping facilitate into our stormwater system. We really want to sequester stormwater before it actually gets to the bay. There's a whole lot of things going on, but it's like I just named probably 10 different departments who have to work on it. And of course, we have our rapid transit vision. That vision still is intact, even though we don't have LRT vehicles on the ground yet. If you read this vision, it's very interesting because it doesn't talk too much about getting people from place to place. It talks a lot about placemaking, sustainability, economic development, because it was understood very early on in the project that this is really what rapid transit is about. If it were just a transit project, it may never have gotten built or thought of. It really was about a lot of other things. And I'll give you some examples of when we're designing, whether they be buses or transit, this kind of, we're not looking for this kind of LRT that they have in Calgary as an example, where you really separate the pedestrian from the actual transit vehicle. And we don't want transit vehicles in mixed-use traffic because they don't have the advantage over the automobile. We're trying to foster that advantage. This is Lyon, France. This is more of the direction we're heading into, rapid and reliable. And really tracks you can even cross. It's okay to cross tracks. Low floor is key. Buses, trains, they're both being made low floor now. And so you have this, if you're in a wheelchair, it's easy to board the train, so it's level boarding. Are you making a bus stop? Are you making a bus station? What are you doing at the bus stop? Can you do anything else? Be flush with the roadway. If we're doing trains, it might be overhead powered. Integration is really important. So the street cafe right beside the, this may not, in a 1980s style of building something, I don't think this would be built like this. This is probably but anyways. You want to integrate right into what's happening in the street light. There are times where we could put a transit vehicle there, but we don't have cars, we just have pedestrians for transit vehicles. I think that's totally acceptable in certain areas. So, and then I focused on is creating, I'm just maybe obsessed with people places, because I think that's what's going to get people on transit too. You don't want to just wait in no man's land. And then stimulating that development, we really want to do that's really important. So along that corridor where you saw those blue triangles, transit's not a silver bullet, but if you're matching your land use with transit, it's a good combination. This is the school board building. Has everyone seen it before? Just randomly, do you think it was a nice looking building? Okay, who thought it was ugly? Great, why did you think it was ugly? Anyone, it's okay, you can say it. You're not going to offend me. I didn't build it.
It was unnatural.
It was unnatural, okay. It has a lot of concrete. The windows were small.
It's a fascist design, really. It's a lot like Mussolini style building.
So, do you think it should be, so a lot of, it's funny because a lot of people said this building is ugly, tear it down. It's ugly anyway. Unfortunately, they also said that about Old City Hall. So if you look at Toronto's City Hall, by the way, I think the building's ugly. No offense to people like that. But the Toronto City Hall, Old City Hall, not New City Hall, which I also don't very much, but Old City Hall is a classic, beautiful building. We have this essentially the same building in Hamilton, but it was old and it got dilapidated, and we tore it down. Well, we didn't. We sold it to someone, and they tore it down. So the thought is, maybe there's value to having this building there. Anyway, maybe there was something that we didn't capture the intrinsic value of the building. I don't know. McMaster's building is living there now. It's almost done. It looks very nice. But I guess this is, we're in our development boom. So how do we as a community, what do we value? What buildings do we value? What should we do with them? I think this has become a major question either way. Because, and in this room we had a lot of differing opinions on whether that building was good or not. And then there's this building, which is James Street Baptist Church. And this part of the church has now been knocked down, but the facade will remain, and we'll build a 30-story building behind it. For some, that makes a lot of sense, and it's a good design. For others, it was a cop-out on the developer's part, and it should have maintained more of the church. So I think these debates are going to continue in the city, and they are definitely a part of what, our buildings are a part of what makes our city our city. But again, and I know that in the 1950s and 60s, there was an idea of leaving behind the Victorian era, which essentially produced a few world wars. And so knocking down the buildings wasn't just about utility, but it was about, maybe erasing that piece of the past. I've been told by some. Maybe that's too controversial. I don't mind talking about it. I guess at the end of the day, I didn't like, another example, I thought old New City Hall, the city hall we currently have, is ugly. I look at it today and I think it's wonderful. So it's hard to, as a community, understand what the value of these buildings are and then what to do with them. So whether it's our natural environment or our built environment, we have to make really hard decisions. Do we take away farmland because we want to build more employment lands by the airport? Do we knock down James Street Baptist Church because we need to have more density in the downtown core in places where it requires us to have the density? Is this a good, maybe this is a good urban design aesthetic, keep parts of the building and get rid of the rest. I'm just throwing out the ideas there right now. I'll leave it at that. Yeah, I had some questions I like to ask, because I find myself an advocate of maintaining some of our heritage buildings, but where do you draw the line? And is it acceptable for someone to say, well, I own the building and I couldn't upkeep it, so now it's going to fall apart? Where is the onus? Who's responsible then? If a person can own a building and let it fall apart, and then that's why you have to tear it down, is that fair for them to have done that? But I want to move into transportation because I guess it's my bread and butter. I'm going to talk a little bit about bringing some of the concepts we talked about in the first two sections. Talk about autofocus, and then its perception and reality of transportation, what growth in transportation means, and we'll talk about sustainable mobility at the end. I have a plug for a project that I'm working on. But why do I've talked a lot about cars. I'm a car driver. I used to be a car driver first. I'm probably a pedestrian first now. But obviously, there's a lot. I'm thinking of myself when I was 16, 17, and 18. Cars were definitely, it was a convenience, I think, for me. That was the most important. I probably couldn't afford a car in the picture. But, it's interesting culturally that you are rewarded for having a license. Getting a license is a reward. And it's a rite of passage. So there's also associations there. Popularity, wealth, and mobility are three key ones, I think. And I love this, I don't know the cultural reinforcement of autocentricity. But GM, this is a GM, I think it's from last year or year before, but they had to pull these ads. And reality sucks. Luckily, the GM colleges count doesn't. And then, of course, he doesn't want to go see him because he's riding a bike. How terrible is that? It's terrible. Stop pedaling, start driving. The one I think that got them in most trouble, though, is this one. Number 3 bus, creeps and weirdos. Luckily, there's an affordable alternative. Car. That's going to keep you safe. And then, of course, if you're a pedestrian, you're in danger. And you're in danger. So, I think this is a really extreme example, but I think it does capture a certain sentiment in our culture, in North American culture. Probably still the predominant sentiment, I think. Even though I used to ask the question, I don't like to ask it because I think most people in the room, you probably live near campus and you are likely, you walk here or you cycle here or you live 0.8 kilometers away and you wait for the bus, 3 buses pass you by and you get on the bus and you get to school. Either way, you probably aren't primarily car drivers. That said, you've probably driven in a car before, and so you understand, I think, intrinsically these concepts. But yes, convenience, lifestyle, culture, status. You know, reality is usually this. It's never maybe sometimes this. I think even if I'm going to Algonquin, I'm pretty much in traffic most of the way now. This and then in the city regardless. So, interestingly enough, in terms of auto use in Hamilton, 50% of all our trips were under 5 kilometers, over 50%. I took all the real stats out of this to make cute pictures. So this is just, please don't call me. But about 70% of those trips were made by automobile, and less than 50% were made by cycling or walking. And this is data I mixed in from 2006 and 2011. So I would say it's not absolutely accurate, but it's pretty much on mark. It's still either way, no matter what the number is. 5 kilometers is probably a far walk, but it's not a far cycle. And while I thought that was bad, not terrible. And then, of course, there's this stat. He's not happy. 50%, 7% of all trips 1 kilometer or less were by automobile. So well, first it's disconcerting, but I like to be a pessimistic optimist. It represents a great potential because I can ship people who travel less than 1 kilometer onto a different mode, whether it be transit, cycling, or walking. And so I think that the reason, now I can behaviorally, I can with changing parking pricing. We talked about parking as a huge motivator of behavior. The more you charge for parking, the less people, the more you price it more competitively with other modes. Parking in downtown Hamilton is probably one of the cheapest in the entire province, or at least the region, the region. If that parking is that cheap, I am likely to make this trip by car. Because why not? It's economically feasible. In downtown Toronto, where I would pay $30 to park, I'm motivated myself even to take the GO train in because I don't want to pay for the parking. Not only that, I don't have to try to find parking. And when I park on the street there, I always get charged a ticket, regardless of whether I park in the right zone or not. So, can we afford the space? Because coming back to efficiency, and a lot of my work actually is to make more efficient use, oddly enough, even though I criticized efficiency in the beginning, is to make more efficient use of our road space. Because the truth of the matter is, whether you're in Hamilton or somewhere else in the GTA, we're not going to build more roads because there's no real space to build roads, and we're not going to stack them. So, we're probably not going to bury it. We might, maybe Toronto's going to bury the ground, like Boston, but likely not. So obviously, you've probably seen this picture before. I like it. It was a good visual. But let's delve into Hamilton a bit more, because this is essentially the Durand neighborhood. Been to the Durand neighborhood before? Hess Village. You ever been to Hess Village, maybe? Like, people from anyone I know from anywhere here has been to Hess Village. This is James Street South, though, which is close to Hess. It is, I would say it's pretty walkable. You can disagree with me at any time, by the way. I didn't give anyone a chance to talk about it. Grid pattern settlement, mixed use, all the stuff we sort of talked about, James Street South has going for it. Probably James Street North too, I just chose James Street South. But I really like looking at streets with the same name. So this is James Street North, this is Upper James Street. Upper James Street. Have you been to Upper James Street? Anyone? Wow, that's amazing. To buy a car, or to go to a big box store. Not that I'm too critical. I big box, I call it big boxing, and I try to trip chain. So I try to go to a bunch of big box stores at once. But, there's the commercial district. Single use, mostly single use commercial. This is the single use residential. Cul-de-sacs, so that they slow down. The cul-de-sacs are great, slowing down traffic and making it more about the local environment. There's good, safe for children. But of course, what's safe for car speeds eventually limits the way to get around, essentially. So it's not transit supportive, obviously. because it's hard to get to. We're not bringing transit to cul-de-sacs. It's not that convenient to get out of the cul-de-sacs. We could build trails. I mean, even making this trip, like people I know who live here, they generally don't make that trip. That trip is short, but they won't make that trip. They drive. So, you know, the first 50 years of Hamilton's development, 100 years, we had streetcar lines in the 50s, and then we had trolley bus lines. They were removed in the 80s. So I don't know if anyone's from Hamilton. I rode the trolley buses. I was aging myself for a bit. We do rely on our cars now. Cars connect communities primarily, not only. And we designed our neighborhoods around the car. Not only that, at the same time, we designed physical activity out of people's lives. Because physical activity now is something you go to do, not necessarily something you're going to do because it's on your way, right? So I think that it's very interesting. We did it across North America though, so I'm not criticizing just Hamilton. And of course, by the more we extend away from the city core, the more ineffective we make conventional transit. I want to talk a lot about other forms of transit, but right now, in terms of conventional transit, it doesn't really suit the communities that are around far away from the core. There is on-demand forms of transit that could be better applied, but we don't have it. There's definitely challenges to our growth, right? We're going to have a population growth in the whole region, and a whole bunch more people living in Hamilton. If we don't plan for them, we're going to have to essentially meet their car driving needs. We know that climate change has a cost. It has a social and environmental cost. It has an economic cost as well. And I have these stats. I don't know if I guess I believe in them. You know, $9 billion. There's lots of stats here that you can argue and find other kinds of stats, but essentially there's a cost. I think we can all disagree on that. And the travel time between, even in Hamilton and between Hamilton and other cities, is growing. It's growing a lot. And that's why the province has brought the big move. You've probably heard of the big move. And a lot of the stuff that we're working on now, whether it be the rapid transit project or some of the bike share stuff that I'm going to talk about later, essentially is a product of the big move, and which is the regional plan for transportation between Durham and Hamilton. So what are our potential solutions? If you've been listening, do you think that increasing roads will solve our problems to meet our population growth? Okay, one person? That's good. The fundamental law of road congestion and the capacity of any road will reach the maximum due to latent demand. So eventually, whatever you build, it will fill up. And one great example is the Lincoln-Alexander Parkway. We built the expressway. Expressways are convenient, but I think it took 6 years, I think, because of the development boom around it, for it to essentially meet its maximum capacity. So it's maximum. And the Red Hill did it, I think, in 4 years. So we built more roads, we had more development, more people now, it became even easier to drive and live farther away. So of course, we bought more cars, we bought houses farther away, and we used the roads because they were there. So expanding roadways to accommodate traffic is like combating obesity by buying larger cans. So it's pretty true, I think. So okay, well obviously we got to go with transit then, right? Transit has got to be the next best solution. So we can add buses, and I think that car trips will then shift to transit potentially because you'll increase your supply of transit seats. But I would say traffic would likely remain unchanged, and you have just essentially, the road remains congested. I think that if we're going to add transit capacity, we have to deal with modal integration. So how do you're still gonna, so in either scenario you're shifting cars to transit, but how do you get traffic to improve? Well, you have to build better transit, you need to build transit-oriented development, and you need to have road pricing that actually gives a true cost of driving. So I think that's an important piece. You can talk about road pricing already, but if you've heard of HOV lanes, we have them on the QEW, but also there's HOT lanes. So you can either have 3 people in your car and not pay, or you can be 1 person in the car and pay. So there are schemes like that. Obviously the 407 is a toll road. But a lot of people, and I totally agree, if you're going to have a toll road and you're going to, or let's say you're going to toll all roads, you need to have something in place that people can shift to. Pricing signals work when people have something to shift to. So the other modes are really important. If you don't invest in those modes when you price a road, it could lead to not really that much. Essentially, people who can't afford it now just can't afford it more. And it doesn't really change the game. So I think that's important. Of course, putting a price on parking, which I talked about. We have a lot of free parking. There is a market failure, I guess, with free parking because it incentivizes people to drive. So we want to change behavior. If we want to do that, we have to put a price on it. And then we come to complete streets, another solution. So it's about balancing the need of all road users. So I like complete streets, especially because it talks about people. It doesn't talk about how we move cars or how we move buses or what bicycles will be accommodated. It talks about how are we going to move people. Because at the end of the day, it's people that need to move around the city, not vehicles. I didn't think of that growing up, I guess, but I thought it's about, I'm an engineer, so it's about car movements, but it really is about people movements. You've seen it in New York City. This is a great example of Madrid because this actually has a place for all modes. In that picture, Amsterdam, people love talking about, Holland, Denmark, and then even Waterloo. This is their complete street. It's a good attempt, I think, at a suburban style complete street. Do you think this is a complete street? No. They all. You see the desire lines there, and of course, there's lots of road space, no people space. I love the sidewalks of nowhere. And I think this happens a lot because the development isn't ready for the next phase yet, so we just build it to there. We do it with bike lanes, but it looks and with bike lanes we kind of accepted. It looks much weirder with it's like fail, obviously. And I love signs like this: beware of pedestrians and cyclists. Like, this is something you should fear if you're a driver. Beware of them; they're coming. So we have a lot of we're trying to maintain safety, but if you need a sign like this, then I would wonder if perhaps you designed your road wrong. Because if you need signs to tell people how to behave on a road, likely there's a design issue. Even with a speed limit. If you want to limit speed in a neighborhood, then design the neighborhood so that people drive more slowly. Success is happy now. He's really sad. We're better off now. We have done a lot of things. I know we hear terrible letters in the Spectator saying that LRT is a complete waste of money and the city's not doing anything. But we have a pedestrian mobility plan. We have a transportation master plan that we're updating, and it's going to have a complete streets focus, all the stuff I just talked about. We have some quick wins projects that I want to talk about, and then we have Cannon Street. Have you heard of Cannon Street? Yep, truck traffic, 4 lanes, and all of a sudden it has this really great bike lane, and everyone's talking about it. And it's been, we had about 40 cyclists a day to maybe 100 if you're lucky on Cannon Street before the lanes, and we're already at an average of 300 a day in its first month. So there's a lot of success there with that project. But this is York Boulevard, right in front of the farmers market. We've got 5 lanes of traffic here. No bike parking. It's hard across the street. This is the complete streets design that we did for it. You can see wider sidewalks, bike lanes, a little bit of placemaking. So this is one of our first complete streets attempts actually in the city. I think it was, you can like it or not like it, I'm not sure. People like to criticize it, but I think it's a start. We are enhancing our transit stops to make them be somewhat more integrated. They have bicycle parking, benches, shelters, and eventually they'll tell you when the next bus is coming, but that's not here yet. The bus only lane, everyone's favorite thing to hate. I couldn't imagine a transportation project that had more bad press than bus only lane. I think it beat LRT with the amount of bad press. And of course, the first thing people say is, it's killed my business. My business is now, it's done. I have no proof for you, but it's a disaster. I'm not there are definitely examples where some businesses wouldn't survive, but the vast majority of that is, usually a bus only lane when it's implemented, has a huge outcry, and then it just everything stabilizes. So it just takes a lot of political will to build something like even this tiny little thing. And, you know, its future is maybe, no, this much.
I just thought it was really interesting in the particular letter to the editor that you're probably referring to from last week, or not letter to the editor, about the businesses billing, where somebody referred to their customers saying they weren't willing to risk killing themselves rushing across 4 lanes of traffic. I think you're missing the point. Yeah.
Yes. Interesting.
Not you.
Yeah. No, I was. Am I missing the point? You know, this another example on that street is Laguna. You've been to Laguna? Most, you know, not as, yeah. I've been there a bunch of times. It's great. It didn't change my. I've even driven there, and with no problem in terms of my interaction with that restaurant because of the bus only. So I think, like, anecdotally, personally, it seemed fine, but then I'm really biased. Before I, so yeah, I even I like to be fun of it. But I think, you know, the funny part is the bus drivers like it. The bus times have been better. Most businesses actually haven't had any problems. And the traffic, I know it looks terrible. I think the average drive time has increased by like end to end is like 1 minute. You know, yeah. It's just, this is Hamilton, and like to have any kind, I had to wait a light. I had to wait. I just thought this is crazy. So, yeah, I guess I didn't say that. Okay. So then we had tactical urbanism. If you've heard of it, people went in, put their own pylons in, and said, I want, instead of a you know, that kind of turning radius, we want to make it safer. And they put in their own pylons, and the city said, we're going to sue you. And then a week later we said, but we're going to also make changes. And they made tons of changes, 40 enhanced sidewalks because of that type of urbanism. So I'm not sure how to, I mean, we didn't really like it, but now we're going to react. So it was good. I think we learned a lot from that project, from working with the community. And the community connections from that one thing have been so great. I mean, so many more people are talking about it. These little changes go a long way. So I didn't want to, you know, I think, Yes We Can was an example where the community said, we want a bike lane. And the city said, well, okay, we'll work with you. You know, it's in the cycling master plan, so it's fine. We weren't going to build it that way, but we'll work with you on it. And it's a great example where the community said we want something, and the city said, well, we want complete streets. And this is a complete streets concept. So it sounds like our goals are aligned. So I just think that you know, master plans take a long time to implement. People getting to politicians, and those politicians saying, well, okay, it's a good thing, happens a lot faster. So that's to the credit of those people. Hamilton Bike Share, another project not as unpopular as the Transit, but sometimes unpopular depending on where you live. So this is a 750 bike system with 100 hubs. It's going to go from downtown Dundas to the stadium, and a few stations on the mountain. I don't know if you've heard of it before. It's my project, one of my projects, and so I'm giving it a shameless plugs. Has anyone ridden one of the bikes yet?
Here?
Yeah, no, I was gonna say, like, when are we getting the bikes?
Oh, I thought you rode one.
No.
Oh, the bikes are.
No, like, I took pictures of it, and I touched one, but I never rode it. Because, like, there was, like, 6, and, like, all these hipsters on James Street were just like, ugh.
Yeah, well, hopefully there's enough hipsters to support the use of the system.
Yeah, but, like, all the stations are out, but, like, none of the bikes are.
Yeah, so the stations, well, the problem is that the bikes are all here, actually, in a secret location.
Oh.
So that no one will steal them.
It's those hipsters, because they're just gonna, like,
I want to be a hipster, I can't. But, so, the bikes are here, and the federal FCC in the States wouldn't approve their use, and then they can't come to Canada. Because every bike, so, okay, I can answer your question, actually.
yeah, answer.
So, we had in the 1960s dumb bikes, so in Amsterdam. There was a recognition that, even though there was tons of bikes in Amsterdam, maybe not as much at the time, if we give public bikes, people will likely cycle them. They were successful, but they also got end up in the rivers and lakes, and yes, they end up in Germany. So then, okay, the dumb dog. You put in a quarter, and then you get a bike. And so that quarter is a bit of incentive, but not as much as one would like. And of course, those systems didn't fare too well. Then starting in Paris in 2007, and then picked up by Montreal, Bixby in 2008, 2005 in Paris, 2007, whatever. The smart dock. You know, if you've been to Montreal, Montreal and Bixby are, I feel like, are synonymous to me. So for all, look at all. Toronto Bixby, of course, now called Toronto Bike Share. They have a system. You know, again, you pick up a bike from a smart dock, you put in your credit card, it gives you a code, you get the bike, and then you go to the smart dock and you put it back in. That's the smart dock system. We're not using that system. We are using the smart bike system, which means that a smart bike doesn't need a dock. It needs only a rack. So the racks that you see aren't smart, they're not powered, they have no solar power, they have no wires, they're not bolted. You have 5 or 6 people. So every bike communicates with a central circuit. Those brains are the problem, because the bikes are here, the brains aren't. So as soon as the brains are here, they are system operational. Brains are coming, I'm told just recently, because the approvals are now, we've got the approvals, late breaking news, nobody knows. We'll probably have them in November. And they're offering the system for free until March 20th. So even though it's winter and you may not want to cycle too much, well, you can buy a membership because money doesn't start, cost doesn't start ticking until March 20th. So yes, connectivity, each bicycle instead of each station. Each bicycle has a GPS device and it's tracked. You use a smartphone instead of a credit, if you put your credit information on a smartphone.
Yeah,
or you can, what's that?
I have the app.
Oh, you have the app?
Yes,
There's an app. Yeah, and you can reserve stations 15 minutes before. Because it's a smart bike system, it works a little bit different in that you can reserve a bike, and then you can also park that bike anywhere. You don't have to park it back at a hub. That's the bike. Some people have touched it. If you want and you want to ride one, you can ride it before it actually gets implemented. If you email me, and I'll give you a tour. So, you know, why am I even talking about bike sharing? I mean, there's none in 2009 in North America. In 2011, there's a bunch, but not that many. 2012, this old, there's 30. I don't have the number anymore, but the number's growing. So we have this growth in bike sharing. You know, why? We'll talk about that in a second. But all that bike is really in our region, right? The Great Lakes and New York City, etc. Why? Well, it's this perfect mode to make that connection that we're missing, right? Trips that are too far to walk, and trips that are too close. Sorry.
Too short to drive.
And too short to drive. Thank you. That's that sweet spot that we've really sort of missed. Unless you have your own bike, we've done a lot for that. We have bike racks on buses. We have bike cages. We're at your destination. We built some. There's some here in Mac. Great, but it hasn't got to the point where the average non-cyclist would use a bicycle. So bike share is not about cycling. Bike share is, like everything else, about transit, placemaking, and connectivity, and modal integration. So people will say, well, only cyclists are going to use that. Cyclists say, I would never use that on my own bike. Well, the truth is that people will use it, hopefully. And that it's really about your trip. That trip, no one's just a driver, you're a pedestrian. And you're not always a transit user, sometimes you'll walk. You might cycle to Hess Village and take a cab back. But you can't if you have your own bike. It's much more difficult. So one-way trip making is very important because then you have ultimate choice. But if you don't have enough options, Car2Go is another great option of one-way trip making. Car2Go? Okay. Car2Go works exactly like I just described bike share, in that the car is there, you can take it to your destination and just leave it, and not worry about it. And you just pay for the use of which you drive the car. We engaged a lot of people when we talked about bike share. We had a lot of people, social cyclists, I think someone said, and we used an app and you could vote for the station you wanted. There's 112 stations, it was a lot of fun. Here's what we ended up with. The blue were the ones we thought we'd go with, and we did. And the red ones are the ones that people suggested, so we ended up having more. There's probably more at Mac now. I think Mac itself will get 6 stations. They're just not, they're coming when the bikes come, so the Mac stations aren't even here yet. But what is this all, trying to get us into our discussion, because I talked too much and too long. Yeah, it's like the food guide, where we want to have a lot of the top and we want to get down to the, it's not really, I know I sounded like a doom environmentalist. I talked badly about cars, and I want people to pay more for parking, and I want to make driving less accessible. But I'm not anti-car. I own a car, and I actually drove here in a city vehicle because I was out the field. But so there's room for the car. It's just, we haven't even talked about carpooling, which is like low-hanging fruit, right? 2 people in a car. Transit and then walking and cycling. So from a public health perspective, we would go in the same order. Because every transit trip involves a walk, carpooling trips not always. So there's a huge public health impact. And so when we talk about sustainable mobility, people think of transit usually. How many people think of who thought of it as just transit? Transit, walking, and cycling. Okay. And that's true, but of course, this is the wheel, sustainable mobility wheel, in which is a whole lot of things, because there's policy components to it, there's school travel planning itself and trip making, the TDM stuff I talked about, transportation demand management, carpooling, having integrated mobility, this idea of sustainability and environment, and then health as well. So and the health aspects, like I practically didn't talk about that, but they're probably like have the biggest impact. When we talk about whether it's land use, and building your building to the sidewalk, or the transit stuff I was talking about, or protecting the natural environment and valuing natural capital, all that has essentially its quality of life. And people ask me, well, why do you work for the city? My job in the city is to, what is it? Is it to build transportation networks? No, it's to enhance people's quality of life, because at the end of the day, we're living here and we're working here and we're studying here because eventually we currently want to, and we eventually want to have a high quality of life. It's not necessarily about money or happiness, it's about all these things, right? And that's what quality of life is. So I think that sometimes as a community we might forget why we're doing what we're doing, and that's to really improve quality of life. I don't know, maybe it's to protect the environment as well, but I think all of that, I'm being very anthropogenic when I say that, but as a city we are doing something for our people and surroundings that will benefit our people. There are other schools of thought that would say we should be looking at the ecosystem as everyone being equal players, which I do believe in. I'm just saying from a city perspective, we're generally providing service to our residents. But yes, we should be looking at the ecosystem as one connected entity in which no one has a more favorable position. That would be my ideal, but I am an environmentalist. So that I think is the end of my that's my hour and a bit. But my big question to you first and foremost is, starting with things like bike share, what is the impact of modal integration when it comes to essentially the sustainability of our city? What do you think, is there an impact? What is that impact?